church, the clergy, and maybe a few merchants that were mixed in that you would buy your stuff from, and then everybody else was the workers. They had to work in the fields, they had to, do blacksmithing, they had to do all of that stuff. But when the Industrial Revolution came along, and this new innovation of machines, we started to see that lower class, that peasant class, start to use those and start to use them for their own industry. So if as a peasant you had actually, your job had been to weave fabric, that was your job as a peasant. Day in, day out, you raised your children, you had families, that's what you did generation after generation, you wove fabric. As the Industrial Revolution came along, if you were smart enough and you saved your pennies up, you could buy the first generation of machines to make it go faster. And then as your profit started to roll in, as you were able to make more fabric faster, then you could buy more machines and more machines and more machines until you didn't have just one weaving machine, but you had roomfuls of weaving machines. And you had hired people to come in and operate those machines. So now suddenly we have these people that were of the peasant stock rising up into a new class. And they were doing it within a generation. So it wasn't even that they were spending multiple generations to get to that level. They were doing it within the span of their own lifetimes, which is unheard of before this. Usually if you climbed your way out of that lower class, it took 50, 100, 150 years for the family to change its structure. Now they were doing it in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They're going from peasant class to middle class. And that was pretty dynamic. And so there were a lot of people that were part of that noble class that started to look at this rise of middle class. Lots and lots of people that were fitting into the middle class, and they were appalled. The upper class lived in great big castles and houses like that. And what that ended up happening was that that new middle class tried to do the same thing. They started to build houses and castles just like they saw the upper class doing, because now they were, part of this wealth class too. So they were trying to emulate the class above them. And this has been our historical norm, even from those days of the caveman, to try to rise above our class, to try to aspire to be that upper class. So these folks were imitating the folks that they saw above them, and not always very successfully. So for most of the folks that were part of this new middle class, they saw these new styles they saw, not new styles, they saw the styles of the upper class, or the class that had already been firmly entrenched in the middle class for generation after generation, had been educated in that, and they wanted to do like what they were seeing those people that were part of that society. They wanted to emulate them, but they didn't have the education, they didn't have the background. Remember, they were rising up in 5, 10, 15 years, so they didn't have schooling and lots and lots of exposure to that slow rise into class. And so now they just saw all kinds of new stuff going, all this decoration, and they wanted it. And they didn't know what they were getting, they just wanted it because that was a sign to them of being wealthy. That and having lots of servants. So in a lot of the cases, these people that had grown up as peasants themselves and now were suddenly entrenched into the middle class, they were hiring servants themselves. And their job as this new class was not to mix with the lower classes, but that was their stock. That was where they rose from. So they found themselves using this staff as the people to maintain the household for them. And that gave them more time as this newly entrenched middle class, especially the women that were part of this, because men went to work. They did their jobs. Maybe they weren't so worldly as some of the other folks in their industry, but they still went to work and they did their jobs day in, day out. Their job was to bring the money into the household. The job of the ladies was to manage the staff. And that was great, except that if you weren't actually doing the laundry, if you weren't cooking the food, if you weren't sweeping the floors, if you weren't making the beds, and you had a lot of other people that were doing that job for you, you could only stand around and watch them so long. So what they started to do was they started to get involved in those decorations. And they started to create things that they were seeing of that wealth class, of the things that they had only recognized or witnessed from the fringes. So they didn't really know if it was good or bad. They just knew that they saw lots of stuff like this. So a lot of people in this time, especially women, kept themselves busy with fussy work, with doing decorative stuff like cutting out silhouettes or making lace or doing painting or creating illustrations or whatever, just so that they could show that they had all of this free time. So after a while, this became a symbol for a lot of people, the ability for people to just sit around and do fussy little stuff like this became a sign to them of wealth, of rising up from that lower class part of society. This is all happening from the time of 1800 to the 1860s, 1870s, all the way to 1890s. This idea of trying to have fussy, 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 more and more stuff, to the point where it just became crazy. This is a sample of wallpaper, and it became god-awful, horrible. Look at this. It's completely filled. And there was nobody there to dictate to these folks what was good and what was bad. There were no museums. Nobody had bothered to write books about art history or design history or anything like that. So they didn't really know what was good or bad. They were too old to go back to school to take art history classes or anything like that. And so they didn't know. They had really poor, bad taste. And there were people that tried to fix this. A guy named Sir Owen Jones created a book that was called The Grammar of Ornament, and I know that this is over-embellished and all of that stuff, but it's part of the era, this over-embellishment of decoration. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to educate people. And what he did was he compiled a book that was filled with patterns and with design elements, and they were broken out and explained that this kind of decoration is what you use if you're going for something that is reminiscent of the medieval times. And this is the kind of decoration that you would use if you're designing a room around Orientals. So the book was dissected into segments of history. This is Greek revivalism, and it showed what those kind of decorative elements looked like. And so in his own way, he was trying to push people against this impulse that they had to take whatever pretty thing that they saw and put it together with another pretty thing and not think about how those patterns could potentially clash with each other historically, and all the things that were driving the already pre-established upper class crazy about this new middle class. The upper echelon of society, the ones that were firmly entrenched there, they absolutely hated what was going on with society in that time. They felt that their world was being wrecked. Remember we mentioned Alfred North Whitehead and how any innovation wrecks the society in which it's created. This to them was this rise of the middle class was wrecking society as far as they were concerned. This was the ugliness of what was going on was what was going on. Sir Owen Jones was part of that upper echelon. He was trying to educate, trying to get them to understand. All the same, people kept up with their horrible bad habits and played with this idea of fussiness and just over-embellishment as far as typography goes or graphics go. One of the things that we see time and time again in this era was the idea of children and using them as, again, kind of metaphors for the beauty and innocence and all the things that are good in the world today. So we see a lot of folks in this time using children a lot as a graphic element in the things that they were creating and putting them together in some of these fussy decorative things that they were doing. Part of this was because of Victoria and how many children that she had. So again, they saw, in pictures at least, a very loving, adoring family where the parents were doting on their children. And again, recognizing that that was the norm that they were trying to fit to, they started to do that too. So we see a lot of changes happening for children in this Victorian era, where we have pictures of children that are dressed up beautifully, and they have toys. and they're playing with stuff, and they're treated with beautiful clothing and all of that stuff. Now that wasn't true across society, and that certainly wasn't true historically. This notion of how children are treated is the same notion that we have today. When we think about children, we all kind of go, oh, and we think about babies, and we get kind of soft in the way that we talk like this, and we get really soft and gentle with them. But that was not the norm. What were you going to say?
It's actually come full circle. Half my Instagram feed is full of babies.
Yeah, well, it hasn't gone away. We're still living in the same attitudes that they had in the Victorian era, same as the way that we have the way that we regard marriage. Marriage now is done for the sake of love. It's not for social climbing, it's done for the sake of love. And that started here in the Victorian times, and we still carry it through. But before this period of time, marriage wasn't done for that reason. Marriage was a social contract. We hear sometimes people say, the social contract of marriage. Marriage was a social contract. It was meant to maintain the family name and the family wealth. And that was really what it was about. Love, not really part of it. Now that's not true for everybody. The lower class did marry for love a lot of times, but the upper class wasn't going to imitate them. It wasn't until Victoria married for love that people started to change their attitude. Same thing with children. Because if we go backwards, just 100 years from the time that those pictures were taken of the children, and we look at this portrait that was done, we can see a different attitude towards children here. What do we notice about this particular painting?
The child's being ignored.
Child is being ignored. Okay. Anything else that we notice about it? What do you notice, Adam?
The whole composition is completely different. It's actually set up in the structure. Was that they followed whatever
Okay.
it is.
That's the artist's work at. What else do you notice?
It looks like a mini adult.
Mini adult. Anybody else notice how the little girl is dressed pretty much in the same kind of attire that the grown-up is dressed in? She's not dressed in like, look, this the way the children are dressed here. They got little short dresses. He's wearing knickers or knee-length pants. How many men do we see walking around on the streets like that? Not too many. We don't see any women in those days walking around in short skirts with their ankles showing and all of that. Children had a different attire here, but in this particular picture, that little girl is dressed the same way as the grown-up is, including the bodice. The way that her waist is tucked in tiny, and that she's all kind of cinched in. She doesn't have the boobage yet to escalate what's going on in the front, but everything else about her, she's dressed in the same kind of attire. And what we know is that children in these times before the Industrial Revolution were considered mini adults. They fed them the same kind of food, including alcohol. They expected them to work the same as adults, so children went to work at the same time that the grown-ups went to work. And legally, if the family got themselves into trouble, the children could go to jail too. So there were instances where children were admitted into the military, and there were lieutenants that were as young as 10, 11, 12 years old. And there were instances where children were hung because of the crimes that they committed or that the adults in their lives committed. So children were treated the same as adults. And this changed in the Victorian era, again, partly because of the way that Victoria worked. And as a result of that, we have this whole new attitude that starts to rise up, especially in the middle class, and the way that they treat children. The upper class is still kind of stern with their children, and the lower class, they still put their children to work. They put their children to work a lot. Part of the problem was that the way that they were doing things over the course of just a short span of generations, that they hadn't quite outgrown some of their the things that they had done when they lived out in the country. Out in the country, to have a big family meant that you had lots and lots of hands to help you, raise the cows, and to go out and farm the fields, and to go out and saw the wood, and to go ahead and work on the weaving equipment, and so on. They had all of this stuff available, and were able to keep their industry going because of the number of children that they had. But once they started to move into the cities, those children actually were a detriment to them because they had to feed them. And so a lot of them just sent their kids off to work. They made them work in factories side by side with adults, and we see pictures of these poor, impoverished children without shoes even, that are out in the street, potentially losing fingers and toes and arms and all kinds of things, because these are big, nasty machines, and they don't have the safety features in them that we have today. And these children are working in the factory side by side with adults 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, honestly, side by side with them. And in some cases, the families were so, they had so many children and they were so entrenched in debt as a result of having these children that they let the kids go. And these children were sent out onto the streets to fare for themselves. There were a lot of children that formed into gangs, and they were orphaned by some very nasty people, or they took up work wherever they possibly could, that they raised themselves. And it was a pretty sad situation for a lot of these folks that were on the lower end of the income scale, the lower class folks. But for the folks that were part of that middle class, things were great. We have this, again, new industry, the Industrial Revolution, and people are inventing ideas left and right. And one of the ideas they created was the idea of toys. So toys had existed always. Again, we can go back and we can look at Native American tribes, and we can see that they were creating dolls for children, and they had things that looked like tops or balls or whatever. And they had toys that children played with, but they weren't mass-produced. And this is the first time when we see things that were mass-produced as far as toys go. So children had the opportunity to buy toys, and the whole stores came about that featured nothing but toys for children. That was new. That had never existed before. Now there were toy manufacturers. So this was new. This was certainly not geared towards those lower class folks, because any one of these toys, the least expensive thing that would be on this particular page would be a week's worth of wages for anybody in the lower classes. People certainly weren't going to spend their money on toys for children if they were very poor. But for the middle class, this was not a big deal, and they started to buy things for their children. And this is where we start to see the rise in graphic arts, because one of the toys that became mass-produced was the idea of books. Books are, in essence, a toy. And the guy that really capitalized on this and took advantage of this was a guy named Randolph Caldecott. He recognized, one of the things that he recognized, not only was he a talented illustrator and children's book writer, but he recognized that again, with this new softened version of how children were supposed to be taught and treated, he recognized that children actually do better, they fare better if they're treated lovingly and through play. We know this today, that a lot of things can be learned through play, and so we encourage the idea of play with children. But again, before this time, children were treated sternly. So if children did something wrong, smack them across the knuckles. Don't do that. And even to the point where it was like, recite your ABCs, and they go A, C, D, and then, no, do it again. A, C, no. And they'd make them do it over and over again until it was drilled into their head, and it was painful and scary for children to learn. But Randolph Caldecott and others like him started to say, what if we made little songs about this, A, B, C, D, and the children would sing along, they had fun with it, and he started writing, adding nursery rhymes together, putting them together into books, and making really interesting, fun books that children loved. They would demand to have these read to them over and over and over again. And they were learning through them. They learned how to read through these simple little books. And it wasn't a chore. It wasn't painful. It wasn't scary for them. They enjoyed it. They wanted more. And so by taking advantage of that, Randolph Caldecott made this an industry into itself. And every year he would put together 2 books that he would sell at Christmas time. And these were so popular that people would line up around the block to buy the books that Randolph Caldecott would put out. They came out at Christmas time, so every child wanted a new Caldecott book or 2 for Christmas every year. That was what they wanted. So this became really important. To this day, Caldecott's name lives on. Of course, he's not writing books anymore. He's no longer alive. But they fashioned an award for children's literature off of his name. So if anybody is ever like in the market for a children's book and they want a good quality children's book, well illustrated, well thought through, what the storytelling is, look for the Caldecott winners. Every year there's a new set of Caldecott winners and they will tell you what the best book is for the year. It's a great way to go. So Randolph Caldecott was an important person. Another person that was very important at this time was a woman. Oh my God, surprise, surprise, a woman. Her name was Kate Greenaway. She was part of this more established part of the middle class. So among the middle class, there were those that had risen up really quickly, and then there were those that had been more established or had had long generations of their family being part of the middle class. And I should explain that the middle class was considered doctors, lawyers, merchants, yeah, that was basically it. Doctors, lawyers, and merchants, and maybe some military folk or clergy. They were all considered part of the middle class. And then everybody else fell into the lower class. The folks that were part of the upper class were people that either inherited their wealth, so they never had to lift a finger to work, or they were part of the noble class. That was considered the upper class. And then everybody else either fell into the middle class or the lower class. So Kate Greenaway's family was from the firmly entrenched part of the middle class. With the Industrial Revolution, then we saw a whole mess of other people start to fall into the middle class, including manufacturers, bankers, financiers, shipping magnates, and people that were involved in shipping and merchandising and transportation. So all of these folks started to fit into the middle class, and so that's part of the reason why the middle class rose. In any case, Kate Greenaway loved to depict children in her compositions, and so she wrote a whole mess of books that always featured children in them. And in her depictions, she showed children with really big heads and really kind of funny costumes that were not the norm for what Victorian children actually wore. And as a result of this, there are a lot of people that started to dress their children the same as what Kate Greenaway did. So she spawned a whole fashion industry that was geared towards children's fashion as a result of the way that she was just depicting children in her books. Further, her layouts were completely different from everything else that was Victorian. Here's a good example of Victorian, and here's Kate Greenaway. So Kate Greenaway is doing something that's very clean. It's a lot of white space in it. She's using this kind of different attitude of illustration in her books, and her books were very, very successful as a result of how different they were from everybody else's. She not only did fashion and had a line of children's clothing that came out, but her books were reproduced over and over again. People would buy calendars and almanacs and all kinds of diaries that had Kate Greenaway illustrations in them, all the way up until about the 1920s or so. So from the 1860s, 1870s, all the way up until the 1920s, her stuff was incredibly popular. Some people still collect Kate Greenaway stuff. In any case, those two people were really part of the book industry. Moving into publishing, we see that there were other people that were important to the industry. Now this is a magazine called Harper's Magazine, and although it still has all those bad habits of the Victorian era very, very much emblazoned on the cover or the interior pages of it, they did do some stuff that was groundbreaking. And one of the things that they did was this. The Harpers illuminated a new pictorial Bible. What made this special was that it was not a separate item that they were selling, but it was actually tucked into their subscriptions, their magazines. So what they were trying to do was create a subscription base that had never been done before. Nobody had ever thought of getting people to prepay for their magazines and then have them delivered to them. So they'd never thought of that before. And Harper's created this campaign where they were tucking in portions of the Bible, 10, 12 pages of the Bible, 20 pages, I don't know how many it were, just sections of a Bible that they were printing and tucking into every issue of the magazines that they were selling, week after week after week after week. And what this did was it got people who were of that lower class, or perhaps of that rising middle class, to buy into the subscription so that they could collect all the pieces. And so week after week, people would buy the magazines specifically so that they could have another section that they could collect together. And then at the end of the year, Harper's made it possible for you to send in all of your compiled pieces, the ones that you had collected, and they would bind it for you for free. So then you would have a Bible, and it would be the family Bible. It would be the Bible that you collected. It wasn't really an expensive book. It was just a modestly expensive book, and all it cost you was just to buy the magazine week in, week out. Created loyalty to Harper's Publications, made them soar above the rest of the competition, and so people started to recognize Harper's for being very unique in the way that they did things. One of the other things that Harper's did was they hired a young man named Thomas Nast to work for them. And Thomas Nast came to work for them right around the same time that the Civil War came around, which was around 1860 or so. And he did very beautiful illustrations. Again, they're very over the top as far as we're concerned graphically. Every square inch of the page is filled with some kind of illustration. But they were very sentimental and kind of fit into the sentimental nature of the era. And then on top of it, they also depicted some points of view that people hadn't really considered including in illustration before, and especially in caricature. So Thomas Nast kind of invented this, well, not invented, there were other people that did it, but he took the idea of illustrating and turned it into caricature and used that to the benefit of making statements. And so from him, we start to see the beginnings of what we call political cartooning. He created the image for Santa Claus, for Uncle Sam, for the Democratic donkey and the Republican bull. All of those things that we recognize today, they came from Thomas Nast. He created that invention. The other thing that he liked to do was he played with iconic figures that were corrupt. And his favorite iconic figure was this guy named Boss Tweed. Anybody know who Boss Tweed was? Or anything of the story? Go ahead.
Yeah, corrupt politician. All right, this one New York or Chicago?
New York.
Okay, New York. Basically, it's like, forget what the guy, basically money laundering.
Yeah.
And basically sort of the conventional business practice of the day for these guys.
Yeah, so Boss Tweed took advantage of something that was happening in New York at that time. There was an influx of the Irish that were coming in. He was Irish as well. He was not actually a politician. He just was basically mafia of the time. And he knew that because he was Irish and he supposedly looked like he had made it, that people would look up to him with admiration, especially among those Irish immigrants that were coming into the city. So he could talk to them on the same level. He had made it in America, and they too could make it in America. So they looked at him as an ideal, as somebody that they wanted to follow. And he used that influence to his benefit. So he would talk to the politicians, the real politicians, the people that were really elected into office, and he would say, I can get you the Irish vote if you do this for me. And usually the do this for me was hire 5 of my cronies to do this little piddly job. They're going to give me a cutback. You, politician, you're going to give me a cutback too, and I'm going to get richer for it. And I'll get the Irish people that are coming in off of the boat to vote for you and get you into elected office. And so it's a lot of corruption, a lot of bribery going on in politics at that time. And some of the piddly jobs that he was having them do, that he was hiring people, having these politicians hired them to do, was to be things like, oh, okay, you are the manure inspector for street Avenue A. And Avenue A might be 3 blocks long, but you are the manure inspector for Avenue A. Who the heck needs a manure inspector? But you would have these new jobs that were made up, and those folks would come walk around the street and go, yep, that's manure, and that's manure, and that's manure, and then they were taking money, and they'd give some of it to Boss Tweed, and everybody was happy, except for the folks that looked at this and went, we're going bankrupt, and we're going bankrupt because Boss Tweed is getting fatter and richer, and getting more and more powerful, and so guys like Thomas Nast took it upon himself to point out that this guy was corrupt. And so he did it through political cartoons. Over and over again, he created illustrations that were in the Harper's Weekly that showed Boss Tweed as, like, there he's an emperor in the back, and this tiger is City Hall, and it's eating Columbia, freedom. So Columbia is being trounced by the Tammany tiger, Tammany Hall, City Hall basically, and Boss Tweed is there overseeing it all. So he did illustration after illustration after illustration like this, and Boss Tweed hated this because everybody was reading Harper's Magazine also at this time, and so they were seeing bad depictions of this guy week in, week out, to the point where Boss Tweed actually offered Thomas Nast money to stop. Nast, kind of played along with this for a while and said, "Okay, how much will you give me?" I said, "I'll give you $20,000." I'm like, "Nah, I'll just keep on doing it." And then I said, "Well, I'll give you $50,000." And he's like, getting closer. And he offered like $100,000, and Thomas Nast said, "Okay, I'll think about it." And eventually, he just kept on getting him to rise up, and then he'd have reporters come with him when Boss Tweed was supposed to give him the money, and they would catch him in this kind of sting, and then they'd write about it in the newspaper and start all over again. So it went on and on like this until the point when people started to say, "I'm not going to listen to what Boss Tweed says," and he lost his power. But it took a long number of years, and it's partly because of what Thomas Nast was doing. So he was able to point out the inequalities that were going on in governance. Yes?
Is there any relation to Condé Nast?
No.
Because like Harper's Weekly sounds
Yeah, no, Condé Nast is another publication that has absolutely nothing to do with Thomas Nast. So, good question, though.
even though they're not part of Harper's Weekly.
I'm sorry?
Even though they're not in control of Harper's Weekly.
Yes, yeah. Harper's fell into the hands of William Randolph Hearst, and then from there it got sold to Condé Nast. So later on down the line, but no, it became a Hearst publication for a while there. Another person that was very intrinsic to illustration and design, happened to do a lot of children's books, including Robin Hood that I have right here, was a guy named Howard Pyle. And Howard Pyle actually became a really big, celebrated artist at the turn of the century and into the 1900s, the early 1900s. In fact, he formed a school in Pennsylvania that became a very big deal for a lot of people that were studying illustration. He was considered one of the foremost illustrators of his time. And he had a very interesting perspective. As a child, he had gone to a lot of plays with his mother. She was very into theater, and so she dragged him along with her to a lot of theater-going episodes. And what Howard Pyle noted when he was going to these presentations was how the perspective changed when you were in the audience and you were looking up at the stage versus when you were just standing at the same level on the street looking at something, or when you were just looking at something as an ordinary person. So he really liked the idea of that perspective, that change, that shift in perspective that would happen if you were sitting just a little bit lower than eye-to-eye view. And so almost all of his illustrations have that kind of perspective where it's as if you're looking from the bottom up at the scene. Further, he had a great imagination. He loved things from like the medieval times and from the back hundreds of years ago, and he loved grand adventures. And so he wrote stories and published articles and stories and illustrations that all had to do with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, of Robin Hood, which is what this book is, or even of pirates and things that were happening in the scene, and to the point where his depictions of pirates became what we think of pirates today. Because if you think about it, how often would a pirate sit around and get his portrait taken? You know? Probably not. That was not what they had on their minds at the time. They were out on the sea, and they were out there, robbing people. That was their job, to go out and rob people. They didn't have time to do the civil right thing and get their portrait taken, so there were no depictions, no pictures anywhere of what pirates looked like. And every story that existed about pirates was all hearsay. It was just like somebody passing on something that they had heard from somebody else that had heard from somebody else that had heard. Nobody actually followed a pirate around and took down their life story. That didn't exist. So Howard Pyle, knowing that there was such a thing as pirates, that was true. But writing stories that centered around pirates, well, this is all game. This is all new. So he made it up. He made it up. Everything that he depicted was made up. So our depiction of our imagining of what pirates look like, with the patch over their eye, and the hooked arm, the parrot sitting on the shoulder, and the pegged leg, and walking the plank, all of that made up, fantasy. We don't know if it existed or not. It came out of the imagining of Howard Pyle. And today, when we think about pirates, it's thanks to him. He did it all. He created those images of what these people looked like. So we can thank him for our depiction and for Johnny Depp and for Pirates of the Caribbean and all of that stuff, because this is his contrivance. So those are some important people to know about. There was one other thing that was instrumental in changing design, and it's going to lead us into next week's lecture of how design started to evolve from this point forward, because this pretty much locks us into the norms of this period. We have a few examples of good illustrators and designers, Caldecott and Kate Greenaway, Thomas Nast, and Howard Pyle, all really exceptionally talented people, and their names are worth remembering. But the rest of the stuff that's out there, not so much worth remembering, at least is what it looks like. And that was partly because it was just so overly bad. But the other part of it was that there was nobody out there that was saying, this is bad. And this all kind of came to a head because, again, of something that was done by this guy, Prince Albert. As I said, he was the husband of Queen Victoria. And I said before that people were upset that she had married her cousin. And not because he was her cousin, but because he was from Austria. Why do you think they were upset that she married an Austrian cousin? What do you think, Jessica?
Probably because they thought she'd be better with someone else for family reasons.
Not quite, but good guess. Anybody else? Go ahead, Adam.
This is the Austro-Hungarian War, whatever was going on at the time. I don't remember the specific details, but I know it is just sort of kind of like sleep with the enemy, for lack of better words.
It was considered sleeping with the enemy. Yeah, absolutely. So what was going on at this time was, and again, we have to kind of take ourselves away from the way that the world exists right now and understand what it was like in those days. Here, we all live in the United States, and we think that the United States is the greatest power in the world, right? We all agree, pretty much, sort of, kind of. At least that's the way that's been positioned to us for years after years. USA, USA, we're number one, we're number one. Well, in many respects we are. We're considered a world leader, but at this time, the United States was not number one, not number two, not even number three. Probably number 4 or number 5 as far as world power. That kind of puts us in the position of where Japan is right now, or where we might think of France right now as far as world power. Yeah, they've got a place at the table, but they're not the ones that are making demands and everybody's following suit. The United States was not there. Who was world power at that time? England, yes. Great Britain was world power. Who was number 2?
Russia, I think it's something.
Austria, Germany. They hadn't really united at that point, but Austria was considered part of Germany at that time. Austria, Germany were vying to become world power. They were trying to take it away from the Brits. They had already started to take the power crunch away from France. France had historically been number 2, if not number 1. Great Britain and France had fought for years and years about who was more powerful. Spain was up there too. And then by the time we got to the 19th century, 1800s, France had started to diminish. Great Britain continued to rise, and Austria, Hungary, Germany were on the rise. And it was really Austria, Germany's goal to become number 1 world power. And so when Queen Victoria chose to marry her cousin, who is an Austrian prince, a lot of people saw that as sleeping with the enemy, as was pointed out, that he was going to be whispering in her ear and changing the way politics was working so that Great Britain would be lessened and Austria would be heightened. So a lot of people did not like Prince Albert. They did not like him. They thought it was a bad move on her part to marry this guy. And so they didn't like him for a long number of years until he conceived this great project in 1851. It's called the Crystal Palace Project, or Crystal Palace Exhibition, or the Great Exhibition of 1851, if you will. And what he conceived, well, Prince Albert, let me just say that he was a gadget freak. He loved science, he loved mechanics, he liked all of these new innovations that were going on as part of this industrial revolution. He was gobsmacked by it. He loved industry. He thought it was the greatest thing that he could live through, and he was very excited about everything that was coming along. Any kind of machine that came along, he was right there at the front of the line going, I want to see, I want to see, I want to see. He loved it. And so he came up with this idea to put on a showcase of all the great innovations that had happened up until that point in 1851. It's the Great Exhibition of 1851 to show all of industry and what it looked like right now in the world. And specifically, he wanted to highlight industry in Great Britain because Great Britain was number one. And so by doing this, people started to think, that's kind of good. Kind of like that. Makes us look good, doesn't it? Yeah, so maybe he is kind of on our team. All right. So he conceived this idea, and this building was built, and it was the latest and greatest of technology of its kind. It was using glass and wrought iron, which were new. Of course, iron existed before this, glass existed before this, but actually molding iron into shapes and into forms, and then sliding glass in between it and using that as part of the structure. That was new. It's essentially the same thing as a greenhouse. But they hadn't really thought about building whole structures out of it. But this building was made so that it was made entirely out of wrought iron and glass. And it was huge. It was gigundous. Like here you can see, this is a door. See, there's a door, and there's the floor plan for the building. It was so big that it went on for acres and acres, and literally there were miles worth of exhibition space within this building. And just to put it into context, this building that was made out of wrought iron, designed and built by Sir John Paxton, hired by Prince Albert, it preceded the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower wasn't built for another 36 years later. So just to know in perspective, the Eiffel Tower, when it was built, it was considered one of the greatest inventions ever in history. This came before it, 30-something years before it. It was so big that they had living trees within the structure, that they didn't tear the trees down, they just built the building around them and housed these trees within it. And again, it just went on for miles and miles and miles. And even after this great exhibition of 1851 was over, they still had the building left behind, and they used it for all kinds of stuff. What this exhibition did was it drew people from all over the place. Not just Great Britain, but people came from all over the world because they put out invitations to every country in the world to come exhibit their goods from their country at this great exhibition. And so it was a huge success. People came from all over the countryside, from all over the world. They came to London to see this exhibition. And what that did was it drove up the economy. So all this new money coming into Great Britain at the time, the economy just went boom, went burst. And so people were so excited about that. And they changed their attitude about Prince Albert immediately after that. Then he was a hero to the British people, and nobody had anything bad to say about him ever again. There are 8 miles of tables that were erected displaying artifacts and inventions of all kinds. And exhibitors came from all over the world, and we can see just some of the stuff that they pulled in. Attracted 6 million people to London, which was considered one of the key, key cultural events of the century. So it was really considered a big deal. Now we can see again and again illustrations of what was happening at this exhibition. The problem with this exhibition was in some of the things that were being displayed, because even though they were showing the latest and greatest of innovations, they weren't so concerned about the aesthetic appeal of them. And as I said before, the British had some really, really bad habits not just the British, but anybody that was living of this era, had some really bad habits as far as design goes. And so they showed these pieces willy-nilly in these exhibitions. People would come from all over and look at how these things were constructed and all of that. And so, for some of it was great. The machines, they were great. But when they started to show furniture, then that's where it kind of fell apart. Furniture and decoration of any sort. And you started to see that, again, some really bad habits that were starting to develop among the Brits, and just in design in general, just over-the-top decorations that weren't really very useful or really well thought through. And so what happened was all of this stuff was, being displayed together, and people started to notice how bad some of the stuff was, including this guy. His name was John Ruskin. And he was a art historian and again, part of this elite group of people that had been entrenched in what arts were. John Ruskin was not only a historian, but he was also an art critic. And so he wrote about this great exhibition of 1851, and he panned it. He said that it was endemic of bad taste. And so he was one of the few people that did not think that that exhibition was a great thing. Yeah, financially is a good idea, the whole concept, good idea, but the idea of showing really bad design, bad idea. He was actually part of a group that was called the Pre-Raphaelites. Why do you think they called themselves the Pre-Raphael, or what does that name even mean? Who's Raphael?
Oh, the Renaissance artist.
Yeah, there's a painter named Raphael who was part of the Renaissance, and they called themselves the Pre-Raphaelites. So pre meaning before, so before Raphael, before the Renaissance. John Ruskin was a part of this group that was called the Pre-Raphaelites, or the before the Renaissance advocates. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to bring man back to his roots in design and art. A lot of people that were part of this pre-Raphaelite movement, including John Everett Millais, remember his name from the beginning of the lecture, the Bubbles guy? He was one of the pre-Raphaelites. And not only was he doing things symbolically, but he was also doing things in a way that was in telling the story of the pre-Raphaelites, meaning they wanted to show things that were left over from the times of the Dark Ages. That's what they felt was the beginning of man's real authenticity to art. And so a lot of their depictions showed people that looked like they could be from King Arthur's time and were from that era. And the reason for that was because they felt that those days, when people were still living in cottages with thatched roofs and living out in the countryside, that the folks that were doing art in those days were true artists, that they were practicing their craft, and they would do it for generation after generation after generation. It wasn't just something that they could slap together with a machine, which is what this great exhibition of 1851 was all about. The great exhibition of 1851 was showing what machines could do, had nothing to do with what man could do. And so the pre-Raphaelites felt that man was losing something in this new industrial era, that, again, part of society was being wrecked. They felt that man's closeness to art and, in turn, God was being lost as a result of this industrial revolution. And so they were pushing for man to go backward. And the person that became kind of the leader for this type of thinking wasn't John Ruskin, but was one of the people that started to follow and admire him. His name was William Morris. And when we pick up next week, we're going to start talking about William Morris and this new movement that comes along called the arts and crafts movement. So everything that we've been talking about, this whole Victorian era, leads into a new art movement that we're going to look at starting next week. Are there any questions on this? No? I got through my lecture. So I got through the
Well
lecture.
done.
So here's the plan. So today, when I get back to my office, I will turn on black. Jessica, hang on a second, let me talk.